Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks. It is time for our next weekly update on the Fujimi Enthusiast Lamborghini Countach buddy build that we're doing with Kyle from RKD Scaleworks. We've got quite a bit done. The entire rear end of the chassis is finished, so let's go ahead and get this camera flipped around and take a look at our progress. Alright guys, when we left off, we had completed the front end assembly up here. So we now have the rear end assembly as well. So the engine bay is all complete. The cooling hoses were not near as complicated as I thought they were going to be. They went in pretty well. Things were a little sketchy on the fit for a lot of this stuff. This side fender with the frame components was warped, so I used some heat to try and bend that back into place, and then everything kind of had to be manhandled a little and then glued, but we did finally get everything where we need it to be. So our fuel tanks, you'll see in there, there's a fuel line running out the top of each one. You're not really going to see them, but I did do some modifications. So Fujimi made the fuel tanks an exact duplicate of each other, including both of them having one of these filler necks on the top, which you can barely see right there. Now there's not actually two filler necks because there's not two fuel caps. There's only one fuel cap on the passenger side inside this side vent. So in the back of this vent here is the fuel cap. So I cut the top of the other one off and sanded that all smooth. I then made these fittings that the fuel lines go into, and then ran some, I think that's 32, it might be 30 gauge that I ran for the fuel lines. I also decided to go in and make fittings for the union cable pipe or tube. You can barely see them in there. And then I ran hoses for that as well. Maybe you can see this one a little better. Yeah, you can just barely make that out right there. So I ran the union pipe. It doesn't go all the way through, but it stubs up underneath the chassis and disappears. Another little detail that I added, I made the copper ground strap that goes from the bottom of the engine to the chassis. For that, I just used some of this copper desoldering braid. And I hit it with the black paint marker just to dirty it up a bit. But I had to trim it up a little. But I think that does a pretty good job of simulating that. I just used some ProTech photo etch bolts to make the bolts where those connect up. Another little detail that I added in here, this is the handbrake cable. Now on this car, when you pull the handbrake, it pulls this metal rod. That metal rod pulls this pulley back, and that pulley activates these two cables that run up to your handbrakes. So I went ahead and made this fitting. I made the pulley, and I used some 1/2 millimeter metal hard wire to make the handbrake cable, so I've got the handbrakes all done up. The suspension is an absolute nightmare. Each side of this suspension is 13 individual parts, and some of them are absolutely tiny. This little rod right here is a separate piece from the upright. This rod back here is a separate piece. There's a rod, here. There's one here, one there. I mean, it's all, every tiny little piece of this is a separate part. And it's fiddly. It doesn't fit really well sometimes. You've kind of got to manipulate things. And my axles are too long. Both of my axles did not fit. They were both too long, and they're not the same length. One was longer than the other. So my solution was to come in and cut the rubber bushing off of the axle and glue it to the back of the hub on both sides. I then put a 1/2 millimeter metal pin in them, just a real short pin, and drilled a hole in the center of the axles. And I cut the axles down until I could get these uprights to go in straight so that the wheels would sit correctly, because these tilted down because they couldn't go all the way in because the axle was too long, so your tires were going to sit like tilted in real bad. So it took some work, but we got it done. So if you're building this kit and you run into that, that's the solution I went with, was to just cut the hubs or cut the bushings off, pin them to the axle after you have cut that axle down a bit, and just take little slivers at a time off the axle until you get it to fit right. The rear shocks are 3D printed, and it's not because I really wanted to 3D print them. I lost one of them. I never took any of the shocks off of the sprues, but I went to start doing prepping the parts for the rear end, and I found that I was missing one. They were all there during the unboxing. They were there before. I have no idea what happened to them. So this is the original kit shock. I did some 3D modeling, and I produced my own, which are pretty close. The springs are a little bit thinner, so rather than just replace the one, I replaced all 4 so that they would match. Not that you would really be able to notice, even if you could see them. But honestly, by the time you get the wheels in place on here, you're not really going to see them anyhow. I mean, unless you're looking from this side. The exhaust here, this giant muffler, has these tabs on it. There's a tab here, and there's a tab there where this glues into the back of the engine bay. These are not the same length. There's a long one that goes up against here. The short one actually fits into a slot on the body. So the instructions don't tell you they need to be organized specifically, but they do when you're gluing this together, because you glue this part to this big muffler. When you glue them together, make sure that you glue it so that the shorter tab faces out to the back. I think this is supposed to be an external oil filter. So there's these 2 little nubs that look like fittings. I went ahead and just added some 1mm hose in there. I don't even know where I got 1mm hose. It was in my stash of goodies. So I just grabbed it and used it, and I just kind of disappeared that down into the bottom. This is just a dot on this. I don't even know what this part is, but looking at the real car, there should have been something similar to a radiator cap. So I grabbed one from Small Great Details. I've got the photo etch for the smalls and the large. I just grabbed one, I think this is the smaller one, and I stuck it on there, and that looks a lot better than just the small circle that they had. So yeah. Next up, we do need to sand and polish this body. I still have not forced myself to do that yet, and there is quite a bit of dust that's settled in here. I think I'm just going to sand and polish the big flat parts. I'm not going to try to get anywhere near any of this detail. I don't want to run the risk of burning through it. So I'm just going to sand these big flat areas and just get it kind of, good enough. Especially these fender edges and stuff. But I've got to get that done because the next step is actually the interior, and I need to be able to paint this. And I want to paint this inside. I think I'm going with a white. And the Lamborghinis that I've seen, the Countachs I've seen, the white is actually a bright white. It's not that creamy off-white that you see in most of the muscle cars. It's an actual bright, clean white. But I want to get that painted on the inside, and I don't want to have to be polishing later and get polish all over everything. So I really do need to force myself to do this. I have masked off and painted the windows, just the side windows. I have not done the fronts yet. I need to do that, but I want to wait until I finish with the sanding and polishing, because after I did this, I was like, Justin, you dummy. You're going to sand and polish, and chances are that there's a possibility you could damage this, so I may end up having to remask and repaint it. So I'm just going to hold off on this part until I get all the sanding and polishing done. But again, I've really got to get that done this weekend. So that's going to be a wrap for this video. Our next steps, like I said, we got to sand and polish the body up, and then we can start working on the interior. And honestly, there's 6 steps left in the instructions. So we're getting pretty close to the end of this one. So poor Kyle, he has been getting beat up by the weather. So he hasn't had a whole lot of updates on his, but he is starting to get to work on his. So we've started swapping some pictures. Go ahead and check his channel out. There's going to be a link to Kyle down in the description. Anytime I do a buddy build, I link the channels down below. So go ahead and check him out and give him a sub. Watch some of his other stuff as well. That way, when he does post some updates, you can see what he's doing with his build as well. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I always appreciate you hanging out and watching the videos with me, and I will catch you guys on the next one.